I had a whole bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on, because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand.
Right.
And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me.
They don't.
They tell you don't go into the house on the hill, and it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go away and you think, no, I was wrong. I mean, that's insane thinking. I'm paranoid. I imagined that stuff. That couldn't be the reason for why so-and-so was acting like, could it?
Mm-hmm.
And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of this stuff. Not specifically on track, but that you could, that some of your worst nightmares were real at the time, and you think,
mm-hmm.
he floated in,
Mm-hmm.
sideways,
Mm-hmm.
through a crowd of people. He was wearing black. And it was like one of those old vampire movies where they don't walk, but they glide.
Mm.
And he was a dancer, so he has he's very, graceful.
Yeah.
And he moved sideways, and he just sat down in a chair next to me. And it kind of frightened me.
Mm.
And he's a very smart guy.
Yeah.
The air had turned cold.
Mm.
And then he left, and I wanted to leave. And because I knew that I didn't want to work with him.
Yeah.
And he was getting scary.
Yeah.
And there's a producer I know, successful producer, I will not mention names, but his whole opinion about women on film, from beginning to end, is very brief. He says, women on film, either naked or dead. Both is better.
Mm.
And it's like, whoa,
Mm-hmm.
whoa. The man has got a spiritual malady for a start. I mean, the scary thing is that I think a lot of people think that.
You ever have one of those nights where everything feels just a little too perfect, like reality itself is trying too hard to convince you it's normal? That's how I felt when I arrived at Diddy's New Year's party, a night that would shake me to my core. The invitation came out of nowhere. I wasn't part of any elite circle. I didn't mingle with celebrities or influencers, yet there it was, an embossed card with my name on it, glowing faintly under the light like it knew something I didn't. My friend was ecstatic. This is it, he said, the kind of party where lives change. The mansion itself was something out of a dream, towering, sleek, and glowing faintly under the moonlight. Its sharp angles reflected golden hues that seemed to move like liquid. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, every brand you could name and some you couldn't. Our ride, a tired sedan, stood out like a sore thumb, and I wondered for the 100th time why I'd agreed to this. Inside, the air felt wrong. It was warm and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent that lingered in the back of my throat. The music thudded softly, a low bass that seemed to vibrate through my chest. Guests moved like they were part of some ethereal choreography, their laughter delicate but hollow. It wasn't joy, it was a performance. Diddy's parties were legendary, especially his white parties. Everyone knew the drill: pristine outfits, endless champagne, and an atmosphere of curated perfection. But this wasn't that. The theme was black and gold, yet the attire was anything but cohesive. Some wore costumes so extravagant they seemed plucked from a masquerade ball. Others were barely dressed at all, their bodies painted in metallic hues that glinted under the chandelier lights. It wasn't fashion, it was unsettling, like they weren't people but living decorations for something darker. The countdown timer loomed over one wall, ticking down the minutes to midnight. I tried to blend into the background, nursing a drink I didn't plan to finish. My friend had disappeared into the crowd, his wide grin and nervous energy swallowed by the room's strange pull. I stayed near the edges, watching, but not wanting to be seen. Something about the way the guests moved, the way their eyes glinted with something almost feral, made my skin crawl. At first, it was the little things. The way the chandeliers flickered, casting shifting shadows that moved too independently, or how the mirrors in the hallway seemed to lag when I passed, my reflection delayed by a beat. But then there were the people, the women especially. They were beautiful, too beautiful, like they'd been crafted rather than born. Their features were flawless, identical in a way that made them blend into one eerie entity. When one brushed past me, her skin was ice cold, and for a brief second I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, a plea, a warning, or maybe just a trick of the light. As midnight approached, the energy in the room shifted, the laughter softened, the music slowed, and the guests began moving toward the grand hall at the mansion's center. It wasn't a casual drift, but a deliberate synchronized march, like they were being pulled by an invisible string. I hesitated, but something about the way the air seemed to thicken left me no choice. I followed, each step heavier than the last. Diddy stood beneath a massive chandelier, his pristine white suit glowing faintly in the dim light. But the man beneath it was unrecognizable. His posture was loose, his shoulders slouched, and his eyes were glassy, bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept in days. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a puppet under someone else's control. The commanding presence I'd seen in interviews and on TV was gone. In its place was something hollow, something wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diddy said, his voice slurred but unnervingly steady, "thank you for joining me tonight. It's time." At his signal, servers appeared, emerging from the shadows with trays of crystal shot glasses filled with a dark, iridescent liquid. The substance shimmered under the dim lights, shifting between black and deep purple, as though it were alive. Guests reached eagerly for their glasses, their eyes gleaming with a mix of anticipation and something darker. When a server approached me, the glass seemed to pulse faintly, almost like it was breathing. "Take it," the server said, their voice low and insistent. My stomach churned. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. "I'm good," I muttered, raising my hand in a weak gesture of refusal. The server's eyes narrowed before they moved on, but the unease in my chest only deepened. All around me, guests raised their glasses and drank. The room vibrated with an energy that was almost tangible, a thrumming force that resonated deep in my chest. The air grew heavier, thicker, until it felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. Then the real nightmare began. The chandeliers dimmed, casting the room in a faint golden glow. The women began to undress, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Their shimmering gowns fell away, revealing intricate markings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The patterns twisted and shifted like living things, pulsing in time with the growing energy in the room. Diddy stepped forward, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "This," he said, his tone reverent, "is how we honor the night." The crowd erupted into cheers, but it wasn't celebratory. It was guttural, almost primal. The markings on the floor glowed brighter, casting jagged shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of an unseen force. And then it appeared. A figure materialized in the center of the room, its presence so massive and otherworldly that the walls themselves seemed to bow inward. Its eyes burned like embers, its voice booming in my head without ever moving its lips. "I am desire," it said. "I am the hunger that consumes, the master of lust and the corrupter of souls." Diddy fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "You're here," he sobbed. "Finally, you're here." His voice trembled with a mix of fear and reverence as he prostrated himself before the entity. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a party. It was a ritual, a pact with something far darker than I could comprehend. The guests weren't celebrating. They were offering themselves, their souls, their very beings. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the figure's gaze swept across the room. Its burning eyes seemed to linger on each guest, weighing their worth or perhaps claiming them. The air grew colder, and frost began to creep across the marble floor beneath my feet. Whispers rose around me, overlapping and weaving into a single booming voice that reverberated through my very being. "I am the king of what lies hidden," the figure declared, The hunger that drives men to ruin, the flame that consumes all who dare to draw near. The crowd cheered, their faces contorted into grotesque expressions of joy. Diddy stood, his arms outstretched, his voice trembling with a strange mix of ecstasy and fear. "This is it," he cried, "the power we've waited for." The guests echoed his words in unison, their voices eerily synchronized. The entity's massive hand, ending in claws sharper than any blade, gestured toward the glowing markings on the floor. They pulsed brighter, spreading outwards like molten veins cracking through the marble. The energy in the room surged, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. And then the women began to move. Their bodies swayed in perfect harmony, their glowing markings shifting with each motion. It wasn't dancing. It was something far more ritualistic, each step and gesture steeped in ancient meaning. The entity seemed to feed on their movements, its form growing darker, denser, as if drawing strength from their offering. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. My friend stood beside me, his eyes fixed on the entity with a mixture of awe and terror. "Do you see it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "This is what power looks like." "No," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "This is wrong. We need to leave." He didn't respond, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding before us. The chanting grew louder, the words alien yet resonating deep within me, like a language I wasn't meant to understand, but somehow did. The air crackled with energy, the light from the markings casting long shifting shadows that seemed alive. Diddy stepped closer to the entity, holding a bottle of dark liquid that shimmered unnaturally under the flickering light. He poured it over the women, the alcohol glinting as it ran down their skin. Their bodies writhed and arched, their movements unnatural, almost inhuman. It wasn't sensual, it was something darker, something primal. The entity's voice boomed again, though its lips never moved. "Tonight I claim what is mine." The room vibrated with its words, the energy almost unbearable. I pulled at my friend's arm, desperate to break him from his trance. "We can't stay here," I pleaded. "Whatever this is, it's not for us." He turned to me finally, his face pale and his eyes glassy. "I can't leave," he said, his voice hollow. "I need this." "No, you don't," I said, shaking him. "Whatever you think this is, it's not worth it." But he wouldn't move, his body rigid as the room seemed to close in around us. The guests were no longer individuals, but a single pulsating mass, their movements synchronized as they chanted in unison. The entity's gaze turned toward me then, its burning eyes locking onto mine. The air around me grew impossibly heavy, and I felt the frost creeping up my legs, anchoring me in place. "You do not belong," the entity's voice echoed in my mind. "And yet here you are." I struggled to breathe, my chest tightening as the weight of its gaze bore down on me. "Let me go," I thought, though I wasn't sure if the words were my own or part of the cacophony in my head. The entity's claws extended, pointing directly at me. "Leave now," it commanded, its voice resonating through the room, "or you will not leave at all." I didn't need to be told twice. My grip on my friend's arm tightened as I pulled with all my strength. "We're leaving," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Now." This time, something in him shifted. His eyes cleared just enough for him to nod, and together we stumbled toward the exit. Each step felt like wading through molasses, the air thick with an unseen force trying to pull us back. I didn't dare look behind me, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what might see me. As we burst into the night air, I thought we were safe. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and sobering, but the relief was short-lived. The driveway stretched out before us, lined with black SUVs, their engines idling in the dark. And beside them stood more women, their bodies adorned with the same glowing markings. They weren't waiting to be rescued, they were waiting to be claimed. The women moved in unison, their heads turning toward us with eerie precision. One stepped forward, her glowing eyes fixed on my friend, her hand extended palm up, as if offering him something unseen. "They're waiting for you," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "No," I said, stepping between them. "We're leaving." She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint, lifeless smile. "You don't understand," she said. "You can't leave. Not now." Her words hit me like a physical blow. My legs felt weak, but I refused to back down. "We're leaving," I repeated, my voice more forceful this time. I grabbed my friend's arm again, pulling him toward the car, but he stopped in his tracks. His gaze was locked on the woman in front of us, his face pale and transfixed. "They're beautiful," he murmured almost reverently. "No," I snapped, shaking him. "They're not. Look closer. This isn't right." The woman took another step forward, and the others followed, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Their glowing markings pulsed faintly, casting eerie patterns across the ground. The air grew colder, the frost creeping toward us from the mansion behind. The whispers I'd tried so hard to ignore grew louder, wrapping around me like chains. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, speaking directly into my mind, telling me to stop, to surrender. "Don't listen to them," I said, half to my friend and half to myself. I tightened my grip on his arm and pulled with everything I had, dragging him toward the car. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible force, the air itself pushing back against us. The whispers became a roar, and then, suddenly, everything went silent. I turned my head slightly against my better judgment and saw the entity standing in the doorway of the mansion. Its burning eyes were fixed on us, and its massive form seemed to fill the entire entrance. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a crushing weight. "You cannot run from what you've seen," its voice boomed in my mind. "The mark is upon you." I glanced down instinctively, and that's when I noticed it. On my forearm, faint lines were beginning to form, glowing softly in the dark. They mirrored the symbols I'd seen on the women, their patterns twisting and shifting like they were alive. Panic surged through me as I rubbed at the skin, desperate to erase them, but they only grew brighter with every touch. "What is this?" I gasped, my voice trembling. "What did you do to me?" The entity's expression didn't change, but its voice carried a note of satisfaction. "You were not meant to be here, and yet you are marked now. You belong to the night." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I didn't agree to this." "It does not matter," the entity replied. "You are part of the cycle now." My friend stared at the mark on my arm, his face pale. "We're cursed," he muttered, his voice hollow. "We shouldn't have come." "We can fix this," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. "We just need to leave, now." The women were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate. Their glowing eyes were fixed on us, their lifeless smiles never wavering. I didn't wait to see what they would do. With a final burst of adrenaline, I pulled my friend toward the car. The frost crunched beneath our feet as we stumbled forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. We reached the car and threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the whispers now pounding in my head like a drumbeat. The engine sputtered to life, and I hit the gas, the tires screeching against the icy ground. As we sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. The women stood in a perfect line, their glowing eyes following us as we drove away. The entity was still in the doorway, its burning gaze piercing through the night. Even as the mansion faded into the distance, the weight of its presence lingered, pressing against my chest like a stone. The drive was silent. My friend stared out the window, his face pale and his eyes unfocused. I gripped the wheel tightly, my mind racing with everything we'd seen. The marks on my arm pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of what we'd escaped, or what we thought we had. When we finally stopped, miles away from the mansion, I pulled over to the side of the road and tried to catch my breath. The cold air seeped through the car, but it didn't help. My chest felt tight, my hands trembling as I looked at the glowing symbols on my arm. "What do we do now?" my friend asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever that was, it's not over." Weeks have passed since that night, and the marks haven't faded. They've only grown darker, spreading across my skin like veins. The whispers follow me everywhere, growing louder at night, their voices weaving into my thoughts and dreams. I can't escape them. No matter how far I run, the weight of that night stays with me, pressing down like an invisible chain. I haven't seen my friend since that drive. He stopped answering my calls, and I'm too afraid to go looking for him. Part of me knows he's gone, not in the physical sense, but in every way that matters. Whatever happened that night, whatever we unleashed, has taken hold of him. And now, it's coming for me. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. The marks on my arm weren't just a reminder, they were a connection, a tether to whatever had happened that night. At first I kept them covered, hoping they'd fade on their own, but instead they grew darker, spreading slowly up toward my shoulder. Sleep became a battle I couldn't win. The whispers were relentless, weaving themselves into my dreams and pulling me back to that mansion. In the darkness of my room, I could feel their presence, pressing in from every corner. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, convinced that the entity was standing at the foot of my bed, its burning eyes watching me. One night, after yet another dream that left me drenched in sweat, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might still have them: my friend. Finding him wasn't easy. He'd vanished, cutting off all contact and leaving no trace of where he'd gone. But I wasn't ready to give up. I followed every lead, retraced every step we'd taken that night, until finally, I found him. He was holed up in a dingy apartment on the outskirts of town, the blinds drawn tight and the air thick with the stench of alcohol and something else, something metallic, like the scent from the mansion. When he opened the door, I barely recognized him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But what struck me the most were the marks. They covered his arms, his neck, even creeping up toward his face. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hollow. "It's too late for me." "What's happening to us?" I demanded, stepping inside despite his protests. "What did they do to us?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sank into a worn-out chair, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "You felt it, didn't you?" he finally said. "That power. It doesn't let go." I shook my head. I didn't feel power. I felt trapped. Whatever this is, we need to find a way to stop it. He laughed, a dry, bitter sound that sent chills down my spine. "There's no stopping it. We're marked, chosen. And once you're chosen, there's no going back." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "There has to be a way," I insisted. "Someone has to know what's going on." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, regret, maybe both. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, leaning forward. "This isn't just about us. That night wasn't just a party, it was a recruitment, and we were the fools who wandered into it." My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. Recruitment for what? "For them," he said, gesturing to the marks on his arm. "The ones who pull the strings, who make the deals, who run everything from the shadows. That thing we saw? It's just one of them." The weight of his words settled over me, suffocating and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. The entity, the rituals, the guests. It all made sense now in a twisted, horrifying way. Before I could say anything else, he stood abruptly, his movements jittery and erratic. You need to leave, he said, pacing the room. They're watching me. They'll come for you too, if you stay. Come for me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Who's they? He stopped and looked at me, his face pale and his eyes wild. The ones who never left the party. His words echoed in my mind. The ones who never left the party. My chest tightened as I processed what he'd said. The whispers I'd been hearing, the constant feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I wasn't alone, even when I was. I turned to leave, but he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Promise me, he said, his voice urgent, almost desperate. Promise me you won't try to fight them. I shook him off, my heart pounding. I don't know what I'm going to do, I said, pulling open the door, but I can't just let this happen. His laughter followed me as I stepped into the cold night air. You think you're different, he called after me. You think you can escape, but they'll find you. They always do. The drive home felt endless. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every flicker of light an omen. I gripped the wheel tightly, my thoughts racing. If this wasn't just about me, if it was something bigger, then I had to find a way to stop it. When I got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking them twice, but no amount of locks could keep the whispers out. They were louder than ever, weaving through the air like a sinister melody. I tried to drown them out with music, the TV, anything, but it was useless. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were inside me, burrowing into my thoughts. That night, I dreamed of the mansion. I was back in the grand hall, the air thick with energy and the glowing markings crawling across the floor. The entity stood in the center, its burning eyes fixed on me. You cannot escape, it said, its voice booming in my head. You are mine. I woke up gasping, the marks on my arm burning like they were alive. I stumbled to the bathroom, flipping on the light and staring at my reflection. The symbols had spread, now reaching across my chest. They pulsed faintly, a rhythmic glow that matched the pounding of my heart. I couldn't stay silent anymore. If I was going to survive, I needed help, real help. But who could I turn to? Who would believe me? The police? The media? No, this wasn't something they could handle. This was something else entirely. I started researching, diving deep into the darkest corners of the internet, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. Rituals, ancient symbols, occult practices. Every rabbit hole led to more questions than answers. But one thing became clear. I wasn't the first. There were others like me, people who'd stumbled into something they couldn't comprehend and paid the price. Most of their stories ended the same way. Disappearance, madness, or worse. The few who survived spoke of a constant battle, a relentless fight to keep their minds and souls intact. It wasn't comforting, but it was something. If they could fight, so could I. One post stood out, a cryptic message on an old forum. You can't run from them, but you can make them fear you. The marks are a curse, but they're also a key. Use them wisely. I didn't understand what it meant, but it stuck with me. The marks on my body weren't just a punishment, they were a connection, a link to whatever force was behind all of this. If I could figure out how to use them, maybe I could turn the tables.